Well, for more on this chapter in the Second World War, let's speak with Dr. Richard Reid. He's the historian at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Canberra, and he's just written a book titled Australians in World War II Bomber Command, and he joins us now from our Canberra studio. Richard Reid, thanks very much for your time this evening.
Good evening, Scott.
We mentioned that figure a moment ago of the Australian personnel serving in Bomber Command and the dreadful losses that Australians suffered there. Give us a sense overall, just how big was Bomber Command in terms of personnel? How great were the casualties?
Well, roughly 125,000 men served in Bomber Command, and 55,000 of those were killed in action or in operations. So that's a huge slice, more than 40%.
How does that compare with other operations, other services? That sounds like an extraordinary high number of lives lost, and in percentage terms, very high.
It is. It's getting equivalent to the slaughter on the Western Front in World War I, in say battalions of the 1st RAF or battalions of the regiments of the British Army. So yes, it's among our highest loss rate in action in World War II. There's no doubt of that.
What was the principal role of Bomber Command?
Well, it changed. I mean, Bomber Command, we have to remember, sort of served right through the First World War. The kind of Bomber Command that you had at the beginning of the war, when in September 1939, was a very different instrument to what it grew into during the war. By 1945, it was a large force of bombers, capable of destroying whole cities, and exerting maximum force. At the beginning of the war, it was nothing like that. It was a very much smaller operation altogether. So it kind of grew as the war went on and became something that was a frontline striking force for the British Empire.
Let's talk about the size and the scale you're talking about there at the end, where they were capable of bombing whole cities as they did. In terms of the morality, particularly in the later stages of the war, where it was following through on where I read in your book, where part of their role was to absolutely attack the morale of the enemy civilian population, civilians. And when we see famous operations like Dresden, what sort of effect did that have on how the population saw Bomber Command and its operations at the time?
Well, I think we have to go back to an earlier stage in the war about that. I mean, the decision to move to what was known as area bombing, that's to say to affect the morale of the German population, was made a lot earlier. It was made in 1942. At a time, of course, when the German army was supreme in Eastern Europe and when there were no Western Allied forces in Europe at all. So Bomber Command became the kind of front line of the Western Allies in Europe. As a matter of fact, the Germans themselves said Bomber Command virtually opened up a second front in its attack on German cities and the German war industries. Towards the end of the war, I mean, it wasn't just attacking cities at all. It was also attacking specialized targets in Germany and in France, well after the invasion of Europe, if you like, in June of 1944. But the question you're referring to really goes back to this operation late in the war, in February of 1945, the bombing of Dresden. And of course, Dresden did have a terrible firestorm, and a great many people in Dresden were killed. But I think it's interesting that just a couple of days ago, the current mayor of Dresden has actually sent a message to the Bomber Command Association in London because they have actually put a plaque on the Bomber Command Memorial remembering the civilian casualties of World War II that Bomber Command unfortunately was killing in the course of the war. And they are thankful for that, and said that's a step on reconciliation between Britain and Germany over World War II. So I think people recognise that it wasn't the men of Bomber Command who were responsible for bombing Dresden. They were simply carrying out the orders that they were given. And of course, right at the end of the war, yes, it created an enormous catastrophe for the people of Dresden. Nobody denies that.
Give us a sense what it was like for the air crew in these bombers. What were the conditions like, and particularly when they came under attack from fighters? If, for example, you were a rear gunner in one of these bombers, what was it like?
Oh, it was terrifying. And I mean, these were operations, if you go back to 1943, 1944 in, say, Lancaster aircraft, where if you're a rear gunner, you're sitting in the back of the aircraft, separated from the rest of the crew. You're up very, very high, 30,000 feet or more. With a heated suit, it's freezing cold if that suit doesn't work, and your whole job is to keep an eye out for enemy fighters that might be coming in from stern or from underneath the aircraft, and if you don't see them, they get you. Sadly, eventually, the Germans developed a particular method of attacking the bombers called Schlägermusik, which was coming in from underneath, and the bombers never saw the fighter that actually shot them down, because they had a pair of upwardly sloping cannon at the top of the aircraft, just behind the pilot's seat, and those fired into the belly of the Lancaster. Men never saw what actually hit them, and those planes accounted for hundreds and hundreds of Bomber Command aircrew.
Richard, aside from the casualties, from what you're describing there, the stress and the strain on these young men must have been extraordinary.
Well, yes, because particularly at the height of the campaign, there was a period from sort of March 1943 to March 1944, the period of what was known as maximum effort, when Bomber Harris, the chief of Bomber Command, was sending, night after night, large numbers of bombers against the major German cities and the major German industries, when your chances of survival were very, very low. You had to do 30 operations before you were let off for a period of rest and training other aircrew. And during that period, your chances of getting through those operations were extremely slim. There's a famous story of the crew of G for George, the famous bomber, Lancaster bomber in the War Memorial in Canberra, that when they finished their tour of 30 operations in late 1943 on their airbase, Binbrook in England, that they were in the officers' mess, the sergeants' mess for 3 or 4 days. Everybody came to see them because they were a rarity on the squadron. They had actually got through. People wanted to touch them for good luck.
Richard, you mentioned before how the Germans viewed the effects of Bomber Command and the bombs they rained down on their territories during the war. With the fullness of time and hindsight, just how great was the role of Bomber Command in turning the tide of war?
I think Bomber Command made a definite contribution to the winning of the war. I don't think anybody who examines that objectively today would deny that. What they were trying to do earlier on in the war, let's say, from 1942 on, Bomber Harris, the head of Bomber Command, had this view that you could actually knock Germany out of the war through bombing alone. And that, of course, came from a background of Britain in the First World War, where you'd lost 1 million men in the Empire, and maybe you had discovered a weapon where you wouldn't have to send ground troops into Europe and take on those kind of losses again. So it was an effort to kind of end the war through aerial bombardment to bring Germany to its knees. There is no doubt of that, and that was Harris's objective. That didn't come about. He didn't manage to do that, and Bomber Command didn't do that. But nonetheless, as I said before, one of the German leaders, Albert Speer, said that by mid-1943 to late 1943, so great was the German effort to defend their cities that it had virtually become a second front in Europe, well before the Western Allies actually landed in Europe. I think the other thing we should remember there is that the Soviet peoples, the Russians, were fighting desperately on the Eastern Front and losing enormous numbers of men to the German army. And so this was the least that could be done almost at that time to try and bring the war to the German people. That was certainly the view in London about it. And people like Churchill, were very, very much in support at that stage of bringing the war as hard as they could to the enemy.
Well, you mentioned Churchill there, who, of course, lauded the efforts of the fighter pilots during the Battle of Britain. But as you point out in your book, that he barely mentions the word bomber when handing out praise and thanks at the end of the war. Aside from the legend that surrounds the dam busters, we don't know much about Bomber Command and the efforts and exploits and the dangers these young men faced. Why is it that it has taken so long for Bomber Command to receive its due in the public eye?
Well, I think that's a difficult question to give a simple answer to. I mean, I think at the War Memorial in Canberra, where G for George, for example, the great Lancaster bomber, has been one of the central exhibits for a long time, I think Australians who've seen that have been pretty well aware that, Bomber Command was a significant thing in World War II. The official turning of the back, if you like, on Bomber Command at the end of the war by Churchill certainly meant that Bomber Command, the people who flew in Bomber Command, had to fight for recognition for an awful long time.
Sorry to interrupt, why did he turn his back?
Well, this is the Dresden thing again. There was a nervousness after Dresden that somehow Britain would be held accountable for, as you say, for that this was not a moral thing to be doing. At the end of the war, questions were raised in the British Parliament. There were questions in the United States. And Churchill sent a couple of very famous memos to his bomber leaders saying that maybe we should back off on this because we don't want to inherit nothing but a ruin in Germany, and it might be a blemish. Particularly these final raids, not the earlier raids. But he turned his back at that point at the end of the war and didn't mention the huge contribution that the bomber crews had actually made, to war operations throughout. And I think they felt definitely slighted and definitely quite disillusioned by that, because he'd been a huge supporter of the bombing campaign right throughout up until that point.
How much will wounds be mended then by what is happening at the moment in London with this very important dedication going on in the presence of veterans, including 100 or so Australians?
Oh, look, I mean, for the, elderly men of Bomber Command, and that's what they now are. They're in their, mid to late 80s and even much, much older. I don't think they would ever see this as something like a vindication or anything like that. They would see this as recognition of what had happened to them and their comrades in World War II, and that, it hasn't come before time.